It's time to find out how my January reading went, how many books did I read, how many books did I DNF, and how am I doing with my reading goals. Hello book friends, I'm Jen and welcome to my reading life and welcome to my January reading wrap up. Today we are going to talk all things January books. How many books did I read? How many books did I DNF this past month? And I'm going to give you all the information about how I am doing on all of my reading goals for 2025. Grab yourself a warm beverage, cup of tea, coffee, hot chocolate, whatever you please, and let's get into all the books. To get us started, I thought I would share some of my stats from the month. So I have my little notebook here where I wrote down all of my stats. I'm going to share how I did with my reading goals that I wanted to accomplish during the month, and we'll see how I did. First up, the total number of books that I read in January was 22. That is counting the books that I DNF'd, and I did DNF 5 books in January, which is a lot for me. I don't normally DNF that many, but because I have so many books I want to read from my shelves this year that I just think I don't have the same level of patience for a book that just isn't grabbing me and doesn't seem like what I want to read, but we'll get into the DNFs in a minute. Now, the physical number of books that I read from my shelves in January is 12. That was pretty good. I am pretty pleased with that, especially considering that I also read 2 books off of my Kindle. Well, I read one, I DNF'd the other one, and then I sort of read 2 owned audiobooks. One of them was also that Kindle book that I read. The other one I DNF'd, but I've taken them off of my TBR, and that is what this is all about this year. I purchased 2 books, and I'll talk about those in a minute, and I read 1 library book. If you remember from my 2025 reading goals video, you'll know that I need to read 3 books off of my physical bookshelf before I can purchase 1 new physical book, and I also need to read 2 books off of my physical bookshelf before I can read 1 library book. And I did accomplish that this year. Technically, because I read 12 books off of my physical shelf, I could have purchased 4 books. I did not. I technically only purchased 1 physical book, and then I have 1 ebook that I got from NetGalley. That ebook is actually going to turn into a physical book because I have pre-ordered the physical copy of it for when it comes out in March. And again, we'll talk about it when I get to that particular book. I had also decided I wanted to participate in Epistolary January this past month, and I actually read 5 epistolary books. So that was really fun. And just a couple of other stats, I reread 4 books in January. I had 2 books that I actually carried over. I mostly read them in December, but I did not finish them until January. And I read 15 books in full. That means from start to finish. I started it in January and I finished the book in January. I read the entire book. I did not DNF it. So 15 books counted as like full book reads for January. Not a bad reading month at all. In fact, that's quite high for me. And then part of my goals for 2025 is that every month I want to make sure I read a mystery, a nonfiction, a classic, and a book off of my Kindle. I did accomplish all 4 of those goals. For my mystery, I read There Was a Tide by Agatha Christie. My nonfiction was Jane Austen at Home by Lucy Worsley. My classic novel was, of course, Persuasion by Jane Austen for Jane-uary. And the Kindle book that I read was The Deadly Mystery of the Missing Diamonds by T.E. Kinsey. All in all, I'm feeling really good about my January reading and about how I'm doing with my reading goals so far. But enough about the statistics of my reading month. Let us get into the books. For this wrap up, I am going to first talk about the books I DNF'd, then I'm going to share the books that I reread in January, and then I'm going to share the remaining books in the order that I enjoyed them. Let us start off with the DNFs for January, and the first book I DNF'd in January was Love Begins in Winter by Simon Van Buie. This book has been sitting on my shelf for a very long time, so at least I have gotten it off my TBR shelf. This is a collection of short stories, and, well, short stories, sort of novellas almost in length. I think there's five stories in here. And I read the first 2 stories, and unfortunately, this book just did not work for me. As much as I loved Sipsworth, which was one of my top books from last year by Simon Van Buie, it felt a bit like he was trying too hard in these stories. And I believe this collection was written quite earlier in his career, and I think that shines through in these stories, unfortunately. Other people might really like these, but they just didn't work for me. And so I'm going to unhaul this, and I believe I'm going to donate all of my unhauled books to my local Little Free Library, stock them up a bit, because I have been asked to share what I do with the books that I unhaul. So this time around, I think they're all going to go to Little Free Library so that someone else can enjoy them. The next book that I DNF'd was actually an audiobook, and I have had this audiobook for many, many years. I think it was one of the first books I purchased when I got a Libro FM audiobook account, and that is Reading with Patrick by Michelle Kuo. I think I listened to about 20 or 25% of this book, and I really wasn't enjoying it. It didn't feel authentic to me. And it felt a little bit too much like Michelle Kuo inserting herself into the story in a way that just didn't quite work for me. And I feel like there are lots of other memoirs dealing with similar topics that are done in a much better way, and it just wasn't working for me. So I DNF'd it. And then my next DNF was The Song of Hartgrove Hall by Natasha Solomons. Now, this DNF, there's actually nothing really terrible about this book. I think I read the first 3 chapters, and it just felt like a historical fiction that I would read and then immediately forget what it was about. And I just wasn't interested in that. I feel like the historical fiction market is very saturated, maybe oversaturated, with books that all feel very similar, especially if they're dual timeline novels. And I guess I'm just a little bit picky when it comes to that. So nothing terrible at all about this book. It could have been perfectly serviceable had I been maybe in a different mood or read it at a different time, or a different period of my life. But for where I am right now, it just didn't feel like it was grabbing me enough to want to keep going. So again, I'm gonna donate this to a Little Free Library and someone else can love it. And then my next DNF was a Kindle book, and that was A Study in Charlotte by Brittany Cavallaro. And this is a retelling of Sherlock Holmes, and it's a young adult novel, and I should have known right there that this wasn't going to be for me. It's set in a Connecticut boarding school, I think it's Connecticut, somewhere on the East Coast. And we're following the Watson character, and he is from London, but he's been sent to this boarding school. I think his father is American, his parents are divorced, and or his father at least is living in the US. I decided to listen to the audiobook because I thought that might work better for me than the Kindle. And one thing that really bothered me from the get-go was that the narrator didn't give our main character an English accent, even though he's from London, and he gives English accents to the other characters in the story who are British, so that didn't make any sense to me. And then occasionally this little bit of like an English accent would insert itself, and it was just really off-putting. So a bad audiobook narrator is always a struggle for me, as I know it is for many people. But this really felt like rich kids behaving badly. There was heavy partying and drinking and drug use just very early on. There was quite a bit of violence. The Watson character has a real hothead temper, which isn't Watson's character. And I couldn't. It was too much YA angst, which is why I don't read YA to begin with. In general, as a rule, there are always exceptions. So that's not to say I won't read a young adult novel. And especially I am more drawn to young adult novels that were written before they were called young adult novels. But this is exactly why I don't like contemporary young adult. And so I DNF'd it. And then my final DNF for January was the second book in the Mitford Murder Mystery series, and that was Bright Young Dead by Jessica Fellows. I read the first book in this series, The Mitford Murders, last year, I believe, and I liked it. I didn't love it, but I already had this book on my shelf. I think I purchased this one before I got the first book in the series, and I liked the first book. It was okay. It felt a little uneven for me in terms of some of the characterization and plotting. And again, I started to listen to this on audio because I had listened to the first book on audio, and I would literally zone out for minutes at a time and have no idea what was going on in the story. And so I kept having to go back and rewind and listen again, and then I would still zone out. And I thought, you know what? This just isn't grabbing me. This is, again, a little bit of a mystery series that felt a bit forgettable. And I have so many other both mystery series and just series in general that I want to read this year that I just don't want to spend time on one that I'm not really loving. So again, nothing super, super terrible about this one. It just, again, there was a little bit of like rich kids behaving badly, only in the 1920s instead of the present day. But yes, I'm going to unhaul this one. And I also decided that I'm just going to unhaul the Mitford Murders as well, which was on my red shelf, but I'm not going to continue with the series. And so I'll probably put these together in a little free library. And then if somebody's interested, they can have the first 2 books in the series. So might be someone's lucky day. Next up, let's get into the books that I reread in January. And first up are 2 books that I actually finished in January, but mostly read in December. And the first is a short story collection by my favorite author, Laurie Colwin. This is Passion and Affect. I buddy read this with a group of friends, and it was really lovely to revisit. I haven't read this short story collection, I think, since my early 20s when I first read it. I'm not sure I've ever reread it. And I have to say, this isn't my favorite of Laurie Colwin's short story collections, and I definitely don't recommend starting with this book. If you're looking to read a Laurie Colwin book, I highly recommend starting either with Happy All the Time or with Home Cooking, depending on if you want fiction or nonfiction. This collection of short stories, as so many collections of short stories are, was a little bit hit and miss. There were some stories that I loved, some stories that I didn't care for that much. The one thing I will say, and the reason Laurie Colwin is a favorite author of mine, is that even if I don't always love what she's saying, I really love how she says it. Her writing is so vivid, it's so evocative, and I'm just immediately immersed in whatever world she has created. Even if it's a world I'm not necessarily enjoying being a part of, I can appreciate what she is doing as a writer. And I will say, when we were having our buddy read discussion of this book, one thing that came up is that the stories in the first half of the book are written from the male perspective, and the stories in the second half are written from the female perspective. And that really changed how we felt about each of the stories. I'll let you figure out which ones we enjoyed more as a rule. But it was just really kind of interesting how we felt about the stories based on whose perspective we were hearing. So that was really insightful, and it was so fun to read this with friends and discuss it, because I don't have a lot of people in my real life who've read Laurie Colwin other than my mom. And then my next reread, which again was another book I finished up from mostly reading it in December, and that was Every Living Thing by James Herriot. This is the final book in the All Creatures Great and Small series, and just so lovely to be in the Yorkshire Dales with James Herriot and his wife Helen and Siegfried and their veterinary practice and all of the farmers, all the people who live in the village, all of the interactions that they have. it's just so delightful. And I did a buddy read of this with Kate Howe, and it was so lovely to chat about it with her. We are both big fans of James Herriot, and now I have to decide what I'm going to read next year between Christmas and New Year's, because this has been my tradition. But I do have a few other James Herriot like story collection books, so maybe I'll pull one of those out for next year. But it was a delight to reread through this series. Can't wait to do it again. And then, of course, my final 2 rereads of the month, which probably don't need a lot of description from me, are Persuasion by Jane Austen and The Unselected Journals of Emma M. Lyon, Volume 1 by Beth Brower. Both of these were for my read-alongs. Persuasion was for Jane-uary, and Emma M. Lyon was for the Emma M. Lyon read-along. Loved them both. What more is there really to say about them? I annotated this edition of Persuasion so much. There were so many quotes that stood out to me on my reread, and I just feel like I got so much more out of it. One, because I read it in conjunction with reading Jane Austen at home, which I cannot recommend enough, and I'll talk about that book in a little bit. But that was so incredibly helpful to giving insight into why Jane Austen wrote this the way she did, why it was written at the time of her life that it was, what maybe played into that from her personal life. And yes, I can't recommend reading that book in tandem with another Austen, and particularly with Persuasion, which was written at the end of her life. I think that really helped my reading of this, and I loved discussing it with everybody. I loved our lives. It was fun to discuss with everyone in the Discord group. Thank you so much if you participated in Jane-uary. And if you didn't, have no fear. Jane-uary is coming back next year, so stay tuned later this year. And I'll be having a poll going out as to which Austen novel we'll be reading in January 2026. And then, of course, Emma. What is there to say about Emma except that I love her? It was so fun to go back to the beginning of her story and just be reminded of all the little details that happened in this first volume. And it took everything in me to not just dive into volume 2, but I actually think I'm going to try to hold off and read it closer to the live discussion, which, if you're interested in participating, is going to be on Friday, February 28th. And I will have announcement going out about that live later in the month, but you can definitely read along and join us for volume 2 if you're so interested. You can also join the Discord group where we will be chit-chatting about volume 2 all month long, but this was so fun. And this was also one of the novels I read for Epistolary January, so that counted for that read along as well. And now we will get into all of the books that were first time reads for me. And again, these are fairly in order of how much I enjoyed them, and none of them were in any way terrible. There were just some I liked and some that I really loved. So here we go. And first up is Letters of Note Cats, compiled by Sean Usher. And the Letters of Note series is just what you might expect it to be. It is a collection of letters by famous people, whether they be writers or actors, politicians, just historical figures in general, all kinds. And this particular book focuses on letters written about these people's cats, or about cats in general. So we have letters in here from a variety of people, from Nikola Tesla to Jack Kerouac. We have T.S. Eliot, as well as Sylvia Townsend Warner and Anne Frank, Charles Dickens, Catherine Mansfield, Florence Nightingale. So you can see all kinds of people with letters that they've written about their cats, or cats in general, or other people's cats, whatever it might be. And again, just like any compilation, some of the letters I really loved. Some of them were just okay. And I mean, I am definitely glad that I read this. And if you are a cat lover, then I definitely recommend giving this a try. It wasn't a favorite of mine, but I enjoyed it for what it was. And then next up was the book we selected for the Cozy Reader Book Club for January, and that was The Woods in Winter by Stella Gibbons. This was Stella Gibbons's last novel that she had published. So she did write some other novels after this, but she never had them published. She I think was really tired of the sort of criticism that goes on when you put a book out into the world, and she no longer wanted to do that. Now, I loved Cold Comfort Farm when I read it a couple of years ago, and it's one of my favorite books. I had high hopes for The Woods in Winter, but ultimately for me, it was just okay. I never really connected with our main character, Ivy, and though she's our main character, there's another character, a woman called Helen, who Ivy actually works for at the beginning of the book. She cleans her house, and so we kind of follow Helen's storyline a little bit. We also have two sisters that we follow, their storyline a little bit, and some other people in this village that Ivy moves to. She inherits a house from her uncle, I believe, and so she moves from London to this home. Before she leaves London, there is a dog that she constantly hears barking near her flat that she lives in. And before she leaves, she decides to go find this dog, and she basically rescues it and steals it from the people who were keeping it chained up in horrible conditions. So I appreciated that Ivy did that, and she takes the dog with her. And she is a quirky character. She loves animals. She loves nature. She's not so great with people. And she's got a little bit of a hard edge to her. And I think that's why I never fully connected with her. But lots of people in the Cozy Reader Book Club did connect with her and really did enjoy her. I have to say, I really love Stella Gibbons's writing. I really loved her descriptions of nature, and I was actually more invested in Helen's story than I was in Ivy's, and so it was just a little bit kind of hit and miss in terms of the different storylines, and there were a few things at the end that I don't need everything to be wrapped up in a neat little bow, but there were a few things that I just kind of wish maybe Stella Gibbons had come back to them and maybe just given us a little bit more information, even if she didn't wrap up the storyline completely. So I won't say any more than that. But again, this was a good book, not a great book. I'm looking forward to reading more Stella Gibbons, but I think from things earlier in her career first, rather than the things she wrote at the end of her career. Next up was the book that I read off of my Kindle, which I actually read as an audiobook because I also had it as an audiobook, and that was The Deadly Mystery of the Missing Diamonds by T.E. Kinsey. And in this one, this is actually kind of an offshoot of the Lady Hardcastle mystery series, and we follow two recurring characters that are, well, I guess actually three recurring characters from the Lady Hardcastle mystery series. We follow Skins Maloney and Barty Dunn, and Skins's wife, whose name is escaping me at the moment, but she's a friend of Flo from Lady Hardcastle. And in this, Skins and Barty have joined a band, the Dizzy Heights, and they're a jazz band, and they play all around London. And then they're asked by Detective Sunderland to help him with an investigation into some diamonds that went missing during World War I and have never been recovered. But Sunderland has some intel that a deserter in the war who presumably stole these diamonds is a member of this private members only club that Dizzy Heights has been playing at. And so he asked the band to basically keep an eye out at the club for him, because Sunderland can't just, send cops in there to keep an eye out, because the jig would be up, as they say. And I enjoyed this. It wasn't nearly as good as the Lady Hardcastle mysteries, but it was an enjoyable read. I liked it. The mystery wasn't super strong, but the characters were fun. It was fun to see some recurring characters and get to learn a little bit more about them from the Lady Hardcastle series. And it was fun to see Superintendent Sunderland again. And yes, so overall enjoyable, not the greatest, but I'm glad I can check it off both my Kindle and my audiobook TBR. Next up was my Agatha Christie pick for the month, and that was There Is a Tide, which is an Hercule Poirot mystery. And we're in Wormsley Vale, which is a small village. And we are following mainly this one family who owns think it's called Wormsley Heath, which is, you know, big manor house. And there's lots of like, you know, brothers and sisters married to people and living in and near either the manor house or in the village. And we're sort of following what's going on with them. And an uncle of the family has died. And this uncle throughout his whole life has always been telling them all, don't you worry, all of my money is going to you guys when I die. You're going to be fine. Plus, he was always generous and helping the family and giving them things. And they never really had to work for anything. They never really had to, you know, worry about money or any of that. And then this uncle dies after having recently gotten remarried to a very young woman. And because he hasn't remade his will, his wife gets all of the money. And then some things start happening, strange occurrences, and a stranger appears in the village and then is promptly killed. And Poirot is called in to figure out what is going on. Now, all of this sounds very typically Agatha Christie-esque, and I was very much enjoying the ride. There were so many twists and turns. I had no idea who done it. And come to the reveal, excellently twisty as Agatha Christie likes to do. And then the last chapter happens. And if you look at reviews of this book, pretty much everyone says it was good up until the last chapter. And then what happened? Because the last chapter was almost like an afterword or a little epilogue of something that happens after the crimes. It's very not in keeping with Agatha Christie. And it's certainly not in keeping with how Poirot, like with his sort of moral center, it just felt very out of character and really kind of icky. And that definitely took this down quite a few notches for me in terms of my rating of it. But up until then, I was very much enjoying it. And if that last chapter didn't exist and the story had just ended at the chapter before, would have been 4.5 stars for sure. But if that intrigues you and you want to read it, or if you've read it and you know what's in the last chapter, let's chat about it because what was she thinking? Next up is another owned audiobook that I read this past month, and that was Elizabeth and Her German Garden by Elizabeth von Arnim. And I thoroughly enjoyed this book. It was so fun. It made me wish I had a green thumb, which I do not have. Gardening is not my strong suit, even though I love a beautiful garden, and it was just lovely to hear all about Elizabeth and her garden and what she was doing with it, and just about her family and friends that came to visit and how she would get kind of upset when she would get torn away from her garden. Really, she just wanted to spend all her time working in her garden, and she didn't want to have to do any of those sort of, you know, regular things we all have to do in life, taking care of our children and our households and all of that stuff, and, you know, making calls to her friends and different things. And yes, so it was just charming and lovely, and it was exactly what I was in the mood for at the time I listened to it. And I definitely want to get a physical copy of it because I'd like to reread it again in the future. There were some lovely, lovely descriptions of the gardens, and I would love to make note of some of those, but I definitely recommend it. And then next up, I read Farmer Boy by Laura Ingalls Wilder. I listened to the audiobook of this, which is beautifully read by Cherry Jones. I love the Little House books on audio, highly recommend them. And in Farmer Boy, we actually follow Almanzo Wilder and his family when Almanzo is a young boy. And we just learn all about his life on the farm with his family, and it was just lovely. It wasn't my favorite in the series for sure. I definitely think I prefer the books with the Ingalls family, but it was fun to read about the Wilders, about how different their life was from the Ingalls experience. And they were just much more settled. You know, they've got this farm they're taking care of. They have quite a bit more money, it appears, than the Ingalls did. And, you know, it was just a different life that they were leading. And so that was really interesting to read about. And I'm so glad that I am continuing to work through the books in the Little House series and can't wait to get on to the next one. And then next was the only library book that I read in January, and that was We Solve Murders by Richard Osman. I actually just finished this 2 days ago, and I think I read it in just a couple of days. It was quick and easy and light, and sometimes, you just want a book that's got short chapters and a really fast tempo, and maybe it doesn't have the most depth to it ever, but it's just really fun and engaging, and you like the characters, and the story just moves along at a really rapid clip, and that was this book. So I think this was a great introduction to a new series by Richard Osman. If you've read the Thursday Murder Club series, then I think you would enjoy We Solve Murders. Definitely give it a go. And yes, I will be continuing on in this series because I thought this was excellent. There was one little bit of the mystery that again, why does this keep happening to me? I feel like I either missed something or something didn't get wrapped up that I really felt like should have been wrapped up. And yeah, so that was kind of a loose end that I'm not sure should have been a loose end, or maybe wasn't because I missed it. But anyway, it didn't really detract from my enjoyment of the story. I wasn't expecting the most well-written book I've ever read, but it was nothing but good fun. Now we are getting into my top books of January. And next up was just a sweet little book that I read in just one short little sitting, and that was the Little Golden Book biography of Audrey Hepburn. I mean, how could you not love this book? It's just adorable. I love the illustrations. It was a very sweet introduction to Audrey, kind of hit all the highlights of her life, and told, a little bit about her childhood and growing up and how she became an actress, and a little bit about her life as a humanitarian. And it was just charming and delightful, and I loved it. So if you're an Audrey Hepburn fan, definitely get your hands on this one. Next up was another middle grade book that I read in January, and that was Understood Betsy by Dorothy Canfield Fisher. And in this one, we follow Betsy, our main character. And when we start, she is living with her aunts, and one of her aunts is taken ill, and the other aunt needs to care for her, and so they can't take care of Betsy anymore. So she is sent off to the country to live with some cousins that the aunts don't think very highly of, but there really isn't anything else to be done with Betsy. And Betsy arrives and her whole world changes. Under her aunts, she's been very sheltered. She isn't allowed to do much. She is she's not spoiled per se, but she's just not given a lot of room to be a kid and learn to take care of herself and do things for herself. And when she gets to her cousins, all of that changes, and Betsy's world just kind of opens up, and in very surprising ways. And this was just so lovely and charming. I got this book in my very first Small Home Comforts book box, and I adored it. Beth is so good at curating books, and this was wonderful. And it's funny because I have one of Dorothy Canfield Fisher's adult novels on my shelf to read, and I hadn't realized that she had written any books, for children. So this was quite the surprise, and I loved it, and I can definitely see rereading this again in the future. If you like family stories, if you like kind of the coziness of that, like food descriptions and the descriptions of how they live, and just kind of that sort of hearkening back to a simpler time. If you like the Little House on the Prairie books, things like that, Anne of Green Gables, I definitely think you would love Understood Betsy. Next up is probably my most unexpected read of January, and that was The Bee and the Fly, The Improbable Correspondence of Louisa May Alcott and Emily Dickinson by Lorraine Tozziello and Jane Cavallina. And in this, these two authors imagine a correspondence between Louisa May Alcott and Emily Dickinson. And it was just fantastic. I mean, of course, I have read both Louisa May Alcott and Emily Dickinson, over the course of my life. I've read different things from them, but I know a little bit about them both. I don't know their entire biographies, but this was really fun to get some insight into their lives through imaginary letters between the two of them. And it's not hard to see how maybe they could have potentially corresponded and known one another. Their lives really ran kind of in parallel in some ways. And though they were very different women, I think that they could have had a big influence on each other, and some of their career and people they knew, like there were some intersections there that were really, really interesting to learn about. And there's lots of kind of bibliographical information in the back of this book, so you can kind of see the nuggets that they took from different places and how they put this epistolary novel together. So if you enjoy epistolary novels, if you're a fan of Little Women, if you like poetry, if you like Emily Dickinson and Louisa May Alcott, get your hands on this book. I highly, highly recommend it. It was fantastic. Almost to the end. I feel like I've been talking forever. Next up is my nonfiction read for January. Well, I read 2 nonfictions this month, but this one was far and away the superior book, and that was Jane Austen at Home by Lucy Worsley. I cannot recommend this book enough. I learned so much about Jane Austen, about her life, about her connection to home, about the connection of home in her novels as well. Just the way Lucy Worsley put this book together was really well done. It was incredibly researched. I learned so much about Jane Austen, and it added so much to my rereading of Persuasion, reading this book in tandem. If you are a Jane Austen fan, I cannot recommend this enough. Get your hands on this book and give it a read. It's very readable. I definitely think even if you don't love nonfiction per se, that you could get a lot out of this book. It is just fantastic. I loved it. And then next up is the very last book I read in January, and it was the perfect finish to my reading month, and that was Dear Hugo by Molly Clavering. This is an epistolary novel wherein we follow Sarah Monteith, and she is writing to Hugo, who is the brother of Sarah's, I think he was her fiance. They were in a relationship together, but he was killed during the war. And afterwards, Sarah takes up a correspondence with his brother Hugo. And really, you're only seeing Sarah's letters to Hugo. You don't see Hugo's letters back. So we learn all about Sarah's life. She's purchased a cottage in a small village, and she is given sort of custody over her cousin's son. So her cousin has gotten remarried, is moving to the United States, and he doesn't know what to do with his son, who's going to boarding school but needs somewhere to go during the holidays and things. And so Sarah is asked to take him in, and she does. His name is Addie. He's a lovely little character. And so you get to see their relationship. You get to see all of the friends that Sarah has in the village, and some people she's not friendly with either. But you learn all about this, and I just found this, I mean, it was so lovely. You get beautiful descriptions of the Scottish countryside and of village life. And then I found the ending to be really sort of unexpected in the most delightful way. And what you think, this seems like you think you know where it's going to go, and it doesn't go there. And I really found that so refreshing. I love Molly Clavering. This is my second book that I've read by her, and I'm becoming more and more of a fan as I go along. And I can't wait to read everything she's written. I just loved this. And my last book, which was just so good. But first, I'm going to tell you a little story about it, and that I had pre-ordered this book. This book is a sequel, and when I found out it was coming out, I pre-ordered it, and then I was getting really anxious. I started seeing people who had gotten advanced reader copies of this book, and they were gushing about it, and I was gonna have to wait until March, and I just didn't want to wait. So I thought, you know what, I'm gonna go see if it is on NetGalley. And I don't have a very good NetGalley score. I am really bad about using NetGalley. But I thought I'll just give it a try. And I got approved for it. And the day it came in, I started reading it and I finished it within a day. And that book is Kate and Frida by Kim Fay. And this is the sequel to Love and Saffron, which was one of my very favorite books of last year. And Kate and Frida is going to be one of my very favorite books of this year. In this, we follow Kate and Frida. Obviously, Kate works at a bookstore in Portland, Oregon, and Frida is in France. She has gone there. She has ambitions to be a journalist, and she's met this other American, and he's also from Portland, and he has recommended she wants some books that she can't get in Paris, you know, written in English. And so she writes to this bookstore, and the letter is given to Kate, and they start a correspondence. And so they're corresponding back and forth, and we learn all about their lives. And as time goes on, they become friends, and so much happens that I don't want to get into. But it is just so lovely, so heartwarming. Kim Fay has a really wonderful knack for bringing female friendship to life and to really making you feel like you're inside that friendship. And just having had friends that make me feel that way in my life, it just brings all those feelings up to the surface for me. And I could gush about this book on and on. I absolutely loved it. I was trying to think if I like this one or Love and Saffron better. I don't know if I can decide. It's so hard to choose, but I do think in March, I'm probably going to reread Love and Saffron and then reread Kate and Frida, because that's how much I love them. And I just want to read them back to back and see what that experience might be like. So if you loved Love and Saffron, mark your calendar. I believe it comes out, I want to say March 11th. If that's wrong, I will put it here on the screen when the release date is for Kate and Frida, but definitely get yourself pre-ordered for that book if you want, or request it from your library. Make sure they're getting it in if you want to order it that way. But it was outstanding. Whew! Made it through all my January reads. That was a lot, you guys. I would love to chat with you down in the comments. Have you read any of the books that I talked about this month? How was your January reading? Did you read something that you really loved? Did you DNF anything? How's your 2025 reading going so far? Also, let's chat about your Read My Shelves challenge. I know many of you are participating in that with me, and I'd love to know how you are getting along with reading the books on your shelves. So how many books did you read off your shelf this month? And if you don't have anything to say in the comments, but you'd like to let me know that you were here, since it was epistolary January, since my favorite book of the month was epistolary, actually both my favorite books of the month were epistolary, why don't you leave either a pencil or a pen or a piece of paper or something along the lines, something that has to do with writing. That would be fantastic. Comments really, really do help my channel, so I appreciate you leaving those emojis in the comments down below. And I love knowing that you were here and you made it this far. And if you enjoyed this video, if you could hit that like button and subscribe if you aren't already subscribed, I would love to have you join my bookish community. And I wanted to give a special shout out to the people who pressed the super thanks button on my last video, as well as those of you who joined my Patreon. Thank you so much for supporting my channel. I really, really appreciate it. And as always, I'll be back with another video very soon. Bye.